Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here this morning. This is Mondays at the Mess, and for those of you who haven't been to a Mondays at the Mess talk before, this is a monthly talk series held by Richmond Barracks in Inchicore, run by Dublin City Council Culture Company. In normal circumstances, we would be in the barracks itself and have a talk in person, followed by tea and biscuits. But due to current circumstances, we've had to adapt like a lot of people. So thank you all for giving this virtual Mondays at the Mess a shot, and hope it will go well. In a few minutes, I'm going to hand over to our speaker for today, who's going to give our talk, Francis Ledwidge, his life and works. Before I do, I just wanted to let you know that there will be an opportunity, if we have time, to ask questions towards the end of the talk. If you would like to ask a question, there's a box down the bottom saying Q&A. So you can type your question in there, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can at the end. And we should finish up at around about 12:30, give or take. So just to let you know as well that this talk is being recorded, so if you have to go halfway through, or if you have a friend who wanted to make it and who couldn't, then you will be able to watch back afterwards, and that will be on our websites, and we'll let you guys know when that's up there. So our speaker today is Liam O'Mara, who I know will be familiar to some of you. Liam is chairman of the Inchicore Ledwidge Society. He's devoted many years to gathering the lost works of the poets and discovering new information about his life. In addition to his books on Francis Ledwidge, Liam has written a trilogy of books on Old Dublin and a number of local history books, including Who Remembers Keogh Square and From Richmond Barracks to Keogh Square. And he was also a member of the Richmond Barracks Renovation Advisory Board. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Liam.
Hello, and I'm here to give you some insight on the life and times of Francis Ledwidge. And I think the best way to begin this is to hear from the man himself. So if we focus on this portrait of Ledwidge taken in 1915, and we'll hear from the man himself, who will give us some background into what you're about to hear. When I was young, I had a care, lest I should cheat me of my share of that which makes it sweet to strive for life, and dying still survive. An aim in sunshine written higher than lark or poet dare aspire. For I grew weary doing well, besides 'twas sweeter in that hell, down with the loud bandity people who robbed the orchards, climbed the steeple for jackdaws' eggs, and made the cock crow ere 'twas daylight on the clock. I was so very bad the neighbours spoke of me at their daily labours. And now I'm drinking wine in France, the helpless child of circumstance. Tomorrow will be loud with war. How will I be accounted for? It is too late now to retrieve a fallen dream, too late to grieve a name unmade, but not too late to thank the gods for what is great. A keen-edged sword, a soldier's heart, is greater than a poet's art, and greater than a poet's fame, a little grave that has no name, whence honour turns away in shame. So there we heard Frank, as he was always known, never Francis. Frank speak about how when he was young, he had ambitions of becoming famous, as we all do. And then, and remember that he was only 29 when he died. But then he matured and he joined the army, and he realized that there were more important things in life. And greater than a poet's fame, a little grave that has no name. But then he qualifies that by saying that there's no glory or celebration to be gained from war, whence honor turns away in shame. That last line was omitted from the early publications of the poem, deliberately withheld, so that it would read as a piece of pro-war propaganda. It's amazing how one line can alter the course of a poem. But why did this man forsake the tranquil surroundings of Sleepy Slane for the pandemonium of the Western Front? What motivated him as a man, and what inspired him as a poet? To answer these questions, we need to travel back to a farm labourer's cottage in County Meath in the year 1887, where our story begins. Frank was one of 9 children born to Patrick Ledwidge and Anne Lynch. The father had secured a sturdy cottage for the family, so although sometimes referred to as a peasant, the Ledwidges were self-sufficient. They had a half-acre of land at the back of the house on which they grew vegetables, and they also kept some pigs and chickens. He went to school here locally in Slane, and here we have 2 of his teachers, Master Madden on the left and Patrick Healy. And he later became good friends with his old teacher, Paddy Healy, and Paddy's sister, Lizzie. And here again, another portrait of Master Madden, who used to brag, "I taught that boy." Frank left school before completing the course, not for the reason he later gave, which was that he had no more to learn, but for more practical reasons. Because his father had died already, and then his brother, who was the main breadwinner, died. So he had to be taken out of school, and he was sent to work wherever he could. He had various jobs, including this one as an assistant at the castle in Slane. You'll see him up there on the left, up there at the back. He famously attempted to substitute the meal that the Marquis of Cunningham and his titled guests were having by rubbing out the chalk board and replacing the menu with pig's feet and cabbage. His lordship didn't see the funny side of the joke, and Frank was dismissed. Today, however, this picture of the staff is proudly displayed at the castle. And here we have W.T. Daly's shop beside the spire in the photograph here in Rathfarnham. The year is 1904, and he had a stint here as a grocer's assistant. At least that's how it was referred to by Alice Curtain, his biographer. However, behind the curtain in W.T. Daly's shop, Daly ran a licensed trade. Frank's brother Michael had originally held a position, and it wasn't long before Frank became homesick and began to hate what he called brick horizons. Here's a closer look at Daly's shop. It later became a fully fledged public house. In a bid to escape from his predicament, he joined the Royal Dublin Fusiliers militia. He signed up for a period of 6 years. Now, the militia were only used in times of emergency, so he wouldn't have seen any service. It was only when there was a shortage of the regular army that happened. But he may have had a few days drilling along the way. The most interesting thing to notice about these papers is the physical description of Francis Ledwidge. Brown hair, hazel eyes, height 5 foot 3 1/4 inches, chest measurement expansion 33 inches, weight 103 pounds, just a little over 7 stone. Now, although he was only 17 at the time, we can take it that the mature Ledwidge was slight of build and short, and this is borne out by a later photograph that we'll come to. So one night he'd had enough of shop life and decided to make his way back to Slane. He had been dreaming of home, and a poem began to form itself in his mind. I walk the old frequented ways that wind around the tangled braes. I live again the sunny days ere I the city knew, and scenes of old again are born, the woodbine lassoing the thorn, and drooping root-like in the corn, the poppies weep the dew. Above me in their 100 schools, the magpies bend their young to rules, and like an apron full of jewels, the dewy cobweb swings. And frisking in the stream below, the troutlets make the circles flow, and the hungry crane that watch them grow as a smoker does his rings. Above me smokes the little town, with its whitewashed walls and roofs of brown, and its octagon spire toned smoothly down as the holy mines within. And wondrous, impudently sweet, half of impassion, half conceit, the blackbird calls it down the street like the piper of Hamelin. I hear him and I feel the lure drawing me back to the homely moor. I'll go and close the mountain's door on the city's strife and din. And this is Severn Trench, a historian who wrote a lot about the village of Slane. And he talked about this subject. Some people think that the spire mentioned in this poem is the spire of the church we saw there in Rat Farm. But Trench tells us that the old name for the village of Slane was the Octagon. And this is because of the four big mansions as you go into the village of Slane, angled towards one another. You can see some pictures here. You see one of them here. And the centerpiece here is a boy with a horse, Jackie Tiernan. And Ledwidge, in fact, wrote a poem about little Jackie Tiernan because he died young. And he wrote a poem, Little Boy in the Morning. Once I was giving a talk in Navan, of all places, and I accidentally referred to him as little Tommy Tiernan. And you can imagine the reaction that got. So here we have an aerial photograph. You'll see the four houses angled towards each other, given the octagonal shape. The poem is definitely about Slane. Above me smokes the little town, with its whitewashed walls and roofs of brown, and the octagon spire toned smoothly down as the holy mines within. So Ledwidge returned home and he became an overseer on the roads. These are just contemporary photographs. He's not in these. Just to give you an idea, Tarmac Adam was being introduced at the time. And he also became very much an activist around his native Meath. In 1913, he founded the local branch of the Meath Labour Union, and he also became a leader of the local branch of the Irish Volunteers. He went to Manchester to talk at the John Redmond Club to raise funds for the movement. The original of this photograph was pasted onto cardboard, which was snapped in two. Perhaps deliberately done so that we wouldn't be able to see who he was with. I think he was linking someone. I had to rebuild his left shoulder and arm by cloning from the right. It was around about this time that he wrote what I regard as one of his best poems. And London is mentioned in this poem, so it may well be that that's where it was written. A twilight in Middlemarch. Within the oak, a throb of pigeon wings fell silent, and a grey twilight hushed the fold, and spiders' hammocks swung on half-open things that shook like foreigners against our cold. A gypsy lit a fire and made a sound of moving tins, and from an oblong moon, the river seemed to gush across the ground to the cracked metre of a marching tune. And then 3 syllables of melody dropped from the blackbird's flute and died apart, far in the dewy dark. No more but 3, yet sweeter music never touched the heart neath the blue domes of London, flute and reed suggesting feelings of the solitude, when will was all the Delphi I would heed, lost like a wind within a summer wood, from little knowledge where great sorrows brood. Now, second row from the back, third person in there in the black is Ellie Vahi, and this is the only picture we have of Ellie. It was a very bad photograph. I had to do a lot of work even to get it to this stage. And here she is with her lace making class. There were a number of women in the life of Francis Ledwidge, but one in particular, so far as inspiring his work. We know that he was in love with Ellie. There's no doubt about that. We just don't know how she felt about him. In his biography, there's talk of a marriage proposal, but this is pure conjecture based on a remark made by someone asked for an opinion who answered maybe this or maybe that, and it was published as fact. So after 30 years of research, I'm none the wiser on this. Sometimes I think there was nothing to the relationship, and sometimes I think that there was a lot more than we were told. Ellie lived on the hill of Slane, overlooking 7 counties of Ireland. It was prime land, and relationships between the landed and those without land were not encouraged. Of course, the hill of Slane is famous for its association with St. Patrick and the lighting of the Paschal fire. And then we have Matt Maguna, best friend of Francis Ledwidge. He worked for the peasant newspaper and also the Mead Chronicle. Matty taught Frank a lot about birds, astronomy, and many other things. He also looked over Frank's poems and corrected spelling errors before they went for publication. And I've enhanced this a little bit just to show you Matty a bit better. Matty was a musician, and his fiddle playing is mentioned in a couple of Ledwidge poems. And he lived in this old house at Dunamore in County Meath, said to be 500 years old. Some say 700 years old. And there are stories of Parnell and John Boyle O'Reilly being in the house. Matt had an extensive library, which he would allow Frank to peruse. But the main focal point was this enormous chimney. And when Frank was there, he'd sit on the hob that went under the chimney, and he could look up the chimney and he could see the stars. And the two would talk into the small hours before Ledwidge would return home on his bicycle, which he had christened Pegasus. And Frank would be on his bike, and he'd leave him part of the way home. They had a cherry orchard, and it would appear that Ledwidge sometimes brought Ellie there because he often refers to her as the orchard maid. Sadly, the cottage was demolished in recent years. This photo shows Matty's sister, Winnie Maguna, in 1985. And this is Edward Lord Dunsany, Edward Plunkett. By this time, Ledwidge and Lord Dunsany, the local landlord, had become unlikely friends. Ironic, you might think that the 2 romances that Frank had with local girls had to be conducted in secret because of local bias. But here his lordship had no problem associating with him and putting all prejudices aside. Dunsany invited him on regular visits to the castle, gave him full use of the library, and promoted his work in London magazines. This we have his Dunsany Castle. He next introduced Ledwidge to a prestigious Writers' Society of Authors at Stephen's Green, and it was this introduction that greatly helped to establish his name. Here he is standing with his mother and his brother Joe at the family home. This photo appeared in regional newspapers and reveals the sudden celebrity status he had. As he said, he had become as important as a new comet. And another one taken the same day. Here we have Mr. Cassidy from the cottage next door, the local Jarvey, and he was after bringing the photographer up from Bow Park to take the photograph. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this place, Richmond Barracks. With the outcome of war in 1914, Ledwidge joined the army and was sent to Richmond Barracks in Inchicore, where the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers were based. He was soon promoted to Lance Corporal and assigned duties in the quartermaster's store. He was with D Company in the orderly rooms in the officers' block opposite the gymnasium. This photograph was taken just prior to his enlisting. You see the W.B. Yeats influence here quite a bit. And the transformation when he joined the army just 6 months after. And this building on my right, you can see a bit of it there. That would have been the block where he was stationed, east of the gymnasium. It became a rather infamous building a year later. And these are the recreation rooms. It's currently the Richmond Barracks Exhibition Centre. In those days, these were the recreation rooms, and where Ledwidge often entertained troops with his poetry. Now, most of these barracks had a makeshift, a wooden hut, YMCA hut, which was a convenience for the soldiers. They could go in there, and they were provided with writing materials. They could sit in there and write letters home. And Frank spent a lot of time in there writing. And this is the reason why. Lizzie Healy. On his day's leave, he was seeing Lizzie Healy, sister of his former teacher and friend, Paddy Healy. He began a long chain of correspondence with her, and whenever on leave, he would visit, always in secret, and never at her home. And I've put a bit of colour in her cheeks, and I often wondered if Frank ever did that. That's a bow at the back of her head there. And one of the letters written on the YMCA paper. Don't know why I'm getting this clicking noise now all of a sudden. Now, Captain Lord Dunsany, his former mentor and friend, was now his commanding officer at Richmond Barracks. And this is a postcard from Basingstoke, where they were shipped. In May 1915, the Inniskillings, including Ledwidge and Dunsany, were shipped to Basingstoke en route to Gallipoli. They camped for a while here on a farm, and they befriended some of the local people. On the back of this postcard, he mentions that these roads were once travelled on by Charles Dickens in his coach. It was while he was in Basingstoke that he learned of the death of his former girlfriend, Ellie Vaughan. She had married another, a man by the name of John O'Neill. They'd gone to live in Manchester, but had fallen on hard times. The marriage was said to be a very unhappy one. Ellie gave birth. The baby survived, and Ellie lived for another 6 weeks. But eventually she died of septicemia. Ledwidge wrote a lament, one of many, to Ellie, and you can see part of it written on the stone here, to one dead. A blackbird singing on a moss upholstered stone, bluebells swinging, shadows wildly blown. A song in the wood, a ship on the sea, the song was for you, and the ship was for me. As I said, the baby survived. Rita was her name, and she went to school locally in Slane. This old photograph was given to me by her daughters, and you can see it needed a total reconstruction. So I spent a good bit of time on this one. And we can see here in the black and white checkered dress here in the front, in the middle is Rita. Rita lived in Navan till a good age. She married and had 4 children. On the death of Ellie, John remarried in Manchester. He completely disowned his daughter Rita and never saw her again. Ledwidge survived Gallipoli, and then experienced fighting in Serbia and Salonika. In a retreat from Salonika in blizzard conditions, he collapsed and was found to be suffering from exhaustion and inflammation of the gallbladder. He was taken to hospital in Murdros in Greece, and here he is pictured with two other poets, an Australian and a Nazarene. The Australian appears to have an injured eye. Note the sand on their boots and the book in Frank's pocket, which was a proof copy of his debut collection. Note in particular his physique, quite small and slight of build. And here's a drawing from that same time. And this was drawn by Fred A. Farrell for the Glasgow Bulletin. Frederick Arthur Farrell was Glasgow's official war artist. Ledwidge was moved to a hospital in Manchester. Now, this was really a school, Lily Lane Primary School, which had been taken over and used as a hospital. It was while he was here that he learned of the 1916 Easter Rising and the executions of the leaders. And here we have De Valera at Richmond Barracks. And some of the other prisoners being visited by relatives. And this is a visit by Prime Minister Asquith in August. He came over to call off the remaining executions and to introduce better conditions for the prisoners. This is a rare photograph of him arriving at the officers' block where the leaders were held and where the court-martials took place. And this is Asquith leaving then. And this is what the officers' block looked like in the days of Keogh Square. And here we have Powder Doyle, himself a veteran of 1916 and later Lord Mayor. And that's a full-size picture of the block where the men were held. But back to the story. Ledwidge was then sent to Abington Barracks in Derry. And it was here that he wrote out a number of poems that he had in draft form or sometimes just in his head. And among these was the poem Tomás MacDonagh. He shall not hear the bittern cry in the wild sky where he is lain, no voices of the sweeter birds above the wailing of the rain. Or shall he know when loud March blows through slanting snows her fanfare shrill, blowing to flame the golden cup of many an upset daffodil? Or when the dark cow leaves the moor and pastures poor with greedy weeds, perhaps he'll hear her low at morn, lifting her horn in pleasant meads. And this is Tomás MacDonagh. Now, this next item is a very interesting one which came up at auction in recent times. And it's a third version of the poem. There are three versions of the poem. It's very interesting because at the end of this, it mentions Chocolate Hill and a drawing. The drawing is not unusual for Ledwidge. He illustrated a lot of his poems. But it suggests that this poem was written not when we were taught, but in Gallipoli in 1915. The bittern, extinct in Ireland for many years, is commonly found in Turkey. It seems that it was originally meant as a tribute to the Irish in Gallipoli, of which he was one, and later adapted for Tomás MacDonagh because he had once translated an ancient Irish poem into English that mentions a bittern. There are other examples of when Ledwidge wrote the same poem for different people. Of course, we have the famous example of Elton John's Marilyn, Candle in the Wind, which was later used for Diana. As late as the 8th of July 1917, Frank sent a field card from the front to a friend in a prisoner of war camp in Germany, saying that he was okay. This was addressed to a Mr. Bergen, Sergeant Bergen. His daughter Maureen was one of the first Ledwidge researchers, and I knew her well. He also wrote to Lizzie Healy after a break of almost 3 years. So she must have been on his mind. And of course, he was composing the Lan on She poem in memory of Ellie. He also wrote a glowing tribute to Major Willie Redmond on his death, thanking and John for all that they had done for the services to Ireland. On the 31st of July, Francis Ledwidge was killed by a shell that landed near a working party of soldiers, of which he was one. They were engaged in laying down wooden boards to enable passage over a muddy terrain. He was killed instantly, blown to pieces. They buried him in the crater created by the exploding shell on the road at Le Carrefour de Ross. And this is the notice in the paper at the time: Mead poet killed in action, by the same weekly independent that had published his early poems. Richmond Barracks was handed over to the Irish Army after the treaty was ratified in 1922 and renamed Keogh Barracks after Commandant Keogh of the National Army, who was killed in the Civil War. The photo shows the British Army marching out and the Irish Army marching in. Ledwidge was forgotten for a time, and the part played by the Irish in the Great War was airbrushed out of history books. The home where he lived was left derelict and in danger of falling into ruin. A group of dedicated people came together to save the cottage and turn it into a museum. They were Garda Clark, Peter Baxter, historian Vivian Igo, Peter's wife Pearl Baxter, Ní Bhaithí, a niece of Ellie Bhaithí, Joseph Ledwidge, brother of Frank, and his son Joe Jr., nephew of the poet. Lizzie Healy married James Shanahan and moved to 23 Tyrconnell Park, Inchicore. She's here pictured with her children and her sister Kate in Inchicore. She died in 1943 and is buried in the graveyard attached to Our Lady of the Wayside Church in Bluebell. Keogh Barracks was only Keogh Barracks for 2 years before becoming Keogh Square, the old soldiers' quarters converted into flats. Around about this time, I thought I'd devote some time to this fellow Ledwidge, having been made aware of his connection with Richmond Barracks by a local artist, Tom Mackin. Little did I know that the subject would consume me for the next 25 years. I attended Ledwidge Day in the Garden at Slane with Michael O'Flanagan, and there I met Pearl Baxter, seen with me here. In 1995, we founded the Inchicore Ledwidge Society, and this is one of the early years with the late Ulick O'Connor. I was invited to Ypres in Belgium to the unveiling of this beautiful memorial to Ledwidge on the spot where he was killed. This photo shows Pete Cheelans of the In Flanders Fields Museum. And on the other side, we have Joe Ledwidge with Dermot Bulger and myself. Now, just down the road from where that is Artillery Wood Cemetery, and that's where he was reinterred after 1918. Mary McAleese took an interest in us as an exhibition in the Civic Museum. We were invited to Oris Neutron in 1998, where I introduced her to the friends and members of the society. And presented her with a copy of the complete poems of Francis Ledwidge, one of her friends at the time, and the full group that were present. And President McAleese wrote a personal letter to me in her own hand, thanking me for the visit. This is the Dan Shaw SIPTU Centre in Navan, which has the main room dedicated to Francis Ledwidge. You can see Francis Devine here in this, over on the left, and we can't see Joe. I don't think he's dotted out. The Ledwidge Cottage today, of course, is a beautifully restored house and a tourist museum. And here in Inchicore, we unveiled a plaque on the recreation room where Ledwidge used to recite to his comrades. We had the late Tomas McGilla here too, and Catherine Bourne. We also have a plaque inside one of the stone rooms at the War Memorial Gardens with his poem, The Irish in Gallipoli. And we also commissioned this portrait from Robert Balla. On the Ledwidge Society, we have our annual event at the War Memorial Gardens, and this year was our silver anniversary. And this was the last, actually was last year, particular photo. Richmond Barracks is now restored, as you well know. It's a beautiful exhibition centre. And here we have a bust of Ledwidge, which we commissioned Rory Breslin to a fine sculptor to make for us. And in this photograph, we see Rosemary Orr of the Ledwidge Cottage in Slane with myself, Frank Ledwidge, Martin McGuinness, and Michael O'Flanagan. And lots of people want to get photographed with the Ledwidge bust, including our old friend Thomas Kinsler, famous Inchicore poet, world famous poet now. There's our beautiful bust of Ledwidge. And there are a collection of books by some local writer that you might have come across. And that concludes my my talk for today. I hope you enjoyed it. There's no point in putting up your hand, I don't think.
Thank you so much, Liam. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really interesting subject, and it's a lovely way to start the week with a bit of poetry as well. So now we're ahead of schedule now, so we've got plenty of time for questions if people would like to ask them. And if you joined us late, just to let you know that you can use the Q&A box down at the bottom to type your question in, and we'll get to as many as we can. I suppose, Liam, to kick things off while people type their questions in, you mentioned a few books at the end there. So can you recommend a good place to start if we want to find out a bit more about Ledwidge?
Yeah, well, the biography of Francis Ledwidge by Alice Curtain is the definitive work, you know, on Francis Ledwidge. I've also have my own biography, A Lantern on the Wave. And there's a selection of poems, 50 poems selected by myself and approved by Ulrich O'Connor some years ago. The best of Francis Ledwidge, and that's it. So between the best of Francis Ledwidge with the poems and the two biographies, my own and Alice Curtain's biography. Now he also has written prose, which you know was forgotten about for a long time, and I have collected a lot of the short stories he wrote, and they're in a book of mine called Edges of the Vine and Selected Prose. So they're all available from the Inchicore Ledwidge Society. We have a Facebook page, Inchicore Ledwidge Society, if anybody wants to go on it and they can get more details of any of this. Are you all right there? Yeah?
Yeah, perfect. Thank
You
you.
haven't lost anything. The screen has changed. Like
Screen has changed. Yeah, that was deliberate.
Okay, good.
We've got a couple of questions coming now. Yeah. So first of all, a comment from Anne Kinsella saying, thank you for that talk. I really enjoyed it. And from Michael McGlynn saying, thank you, Liam. You've been an inspiration to me as a composer. Is your complete poems available in print? You may have answered that just now.
No, I know Michael of Maguna. We're great friends. And the last time he asked me that question, I didn't actually have copies, but I do have copies. So I'll be in touch with Michael on that. He's talking about the complete poems. It's where I a few years ago, I added 66 uncollected poems to the known collection. And so you've got them all together there for the first time. And that's what Michael is interested in. So I will contact Michael and give him the details where you can get that.
Perfect. And for anyone else who might like to have a copy of one of the books you mentioned, is the best thing to do to get in touch with the Francis Ledwidge Society?
Yes, they can go on the Facebook page and they can talk to me there, and they can get my email address. And we do PayPal these days because we can't get out and about. But once you have PayPal, you can still operate.
Yeah, perfect. And I think with Christmas coming up, we're all thinking of how to support independent sellers rather than the company that cannot be named. So a couple more comments now from Catherine Walsh saying, great talk, Liam. Jean O'Brien says this was a very enjoyable and informative lecture and the accompanying pictures were a lovely addition. Thank you. Grania Nolan also says, thank you for a very, very insightful talk. And Joseph Kennedy asks, was Ledward political?
Oh, well, yes, he was. In his early times, he was very much an activist. He supported, although not being a member of the Sinn Féin movement, he supported many of his friends, like Seamus O'Sullivan, and people like that were friends of his. But that particular Sinn Féin was different from the Sinn Féin that emerged after 1918. It was after Griffith Sinn Féin. They were a lot more moderate than they were later to become. I think that kind of clouds that particular issue. But he had to be involved in anything that was going on. A lot of his early stuff was politically charged, with very early writings.
Thank you. Noel Roach says, many thanks, Liam. Most interesting and informative presentation and done with respect for Frank and enthusiasm. That's lovely. Thank you, Noel. And I've lost it now. Here we go. An anonymous user asked, I think this is a question for Michael McGlynn, actually, who commented just now. Has Michael McGlynn ever composed a setting of any of Ledwidge's poems?
Well, I can answer that. I can answer that. He has an album called Behind the Closed Eye, and it's a beautiful album. And in particular, if I can pick a favorite of it, which is hard to do, but Autumn is a particularly good interpretation by Michael McGlynn of the Ledwidge poem. Fabulous stuff. So I would thoroughly recommend that album to any Ledwidge followers.
Yeah, and Michael says August. That's the name of the album.
Yes, and well, I think the name of the album is not Behind the Closed Eye.
Okay.
But the name of the song is August.
Name of the song is August. Brilliant. Ray Kennedy asks, is there a story about Paisley and Foster not coming to unveil the Ledwidge bust?
Well, Paisley was dead, so we can leave Paisley out of it. We did invite Arlene along with Martin, and she couldn't make it. It would have been great to have the two of them there, But Martin was there, and it was fantastic. And of course, we didn't know he was ill at the time. He looked so well, and he would be long remembered at Richmond Barracks for that day when he unveiled our bust for us.
Grania says, always think of Francis Ledwidge being interesting, his friendship with the nationalist Thomas MacDonagh versus his friendship with Lord Dunsany. So interesting and shows his broad spectrum.
Right.
And Michael Challoner also says, thanks, Liam, very informative and beautiful photos. I think Michael McGlynn would like to link in with you about making a film about the album. So that's something for us all to watch out for as well.
Of course, yeah.
Brilliant.
Tell him I'm up for that, yeah.
Perfect. Well, if there are any more questions, then do get those in now. If not, we'll wrap up early.
Yeah.
I suppose just while we wait for people to put some final questions in, who were Ledwidge's inspirations in terms of his poetry?
Well, Keats rather, and a lot of people have compared him to Robert Burns. I think that's where all this peasant poet thing came about, because he was been marketing as Ireland's answer to Robert Burns, he was very much his own man. He was influenced a lot by the Georgian poets, and that's often used as a criticism. When he came under the wing of Dunsany tried to get him more onto the classical stuff, talking about Ulysses and stuff like that. And that's regrettable in a way. I think he was better when he was just writing about nature and that.
Thank you so much. And just another thank you from Rose McQuillan saying, thank you, delightful presentation and very interesting photographs. Happy Monday. A final question in from Anne Kinsler. I wonder, did Frank Ledwidge have any conflict with his British Army career and his Republican ideology? And did he indicate this anywhere in his writing?
It surfaces a few times. There's one call after a court-martial where he appears to have had an altercation with one of the officers who called him a vile name. That's mentioned in the poem after court-martial. But he was very popular. He had lots of friends among the British who were young lads like himself, But obviously after 1960 and everything changed. When he came back here, he went back. Some say he went back to Richmond Barracks. I doubt that. Why he would have had no reason to go back there, because they had all been shipped off to the war front. He went up to Remembers Barracks, where he got himself into trouble, drunk and disorderly. And I think that might have been all got to do with his friends being executed and him just losing interest. And he was very lucky not to be taken out and shot for, the people were for very little back then,
Thank you. Mary Tedders asks, did Francis Ledwidge write a poem called Easter? She remembers a wonderful evocation of the sheep with their little lambs from her primary school book, beginning all of an April evening.
Well, it's not called Easter. There's a few poems where sheep are mentioned. The sheep are coming home in Greece and poems like that. There isn't a poem called Easter. There's a different title for it somewhere.
Well, if you find out what that is, Mary, then do let us know. That sounds lovely.
It doesn't exist under that title anyway.
An anonymous question, how was Ledwidge regarded at the time for joining the British Army?
Well, if he had come back, I'm afraid he would have had a hard time of it, as indeed all of the Irish were who served. And as I mentioned there during the talk, the incident was airbrushed out of history. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And to this day, there are people who won't talk about their ancestors' involvement, and it's just the way things happened. I'm sure when he went off in 1914, he was having difficulty with having relationships with women because of his social status. He might have thought that he would go away, he would become a soldier, come back a hero, and might have a better chance. But everything changed, and he would have been ostracized if he did come home. Of course, a lot of the Irish then, when they came home, they became involved in the Republican movement and used the army training that they'd had for the Irish cause. That happened in quite a lot of cases.
Thank you. A few people mentioning the poem that Mary was asking about just now. Grania says she thinks it's a poem called a song called Whispering Hope, and Colette says that Catherine Tynan wrote All in the April Evening, Sheep with a Little Lamb. So a couple of leads there, Mary. I don't know if that helps
Catherine
you.
Tynan, well, Catherine Tynan and Frank were big friends. He used to correspond with her when he was in the army, and he would send her his poems. So that might be where the confusion is.
That could be where the connection is.
She was a poet herself, yeah. But they were very fond of each other.
Yeah, and Mary Kay also says that the poem is Sheep and Lambs by Catherine Tynan. So that could well be.
That makes a lot of sense now, yeah.
From Tala. Great.
I'm glad I didn't affirm it as a Ledwidge poem, so.
Maybe a lost work. Lots of people.
But they're still out there, you know. There are still out there. I'm still finding stuff, you know.
Where do you find them? You know,
that's the $1 million question, isn't it? They turn up in the most unlikely places. The last time I found one was in an old Catholic magazine called The Sword, the Irish Sword, and it was a little poem. Now they're not all like that exciting because the themes that he's already. There's blackbirds, of course, in nearly every poem he writes, but it's exciting that they're new, that they haven't been collected before, you know. Some are still down in the castle. If you can, there's been a few deaths in the castle. The man I dealt with, the present at that time, Lord Hosseini, had died, and it's his son that's in charge now. I haven't been back since he took over, and Lady Hosseini has died recently as well. So I haven't been in touch with the family since then, but I know there are a few poems still there, and in obscure magazines and newspapers. I had to, and before Google, of course, it was all hard copy stuff. I had to go through reams and reams of newspapers, and they were disintegrating as I was looking at them, and I come out there covered in confetti. But I found, as I say, 66, about 20 of which were never published anywhere. They're in the complete poems. Not trying to plug it or anything, but
oh, plug away. That's really interesting. Well, if anyone does come across any other missing poems, then let the Ledwidge Society know.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you, Liam, so much again for that wonderful talk. I think, like a couple of people have said, it's a really lovely way to start the week.
Right.
And thank you, everybody, for coming along on this very first virtual Mondays at the Mess.